Veterinary medicine is a messy business, both physically and emotionally. Vetsplaining is one veterinarian's attempt to explain and understand her own profession a little better. Join Dr. Lisa McFaddin as she delves deep into the medical and business aspects of veterinary medicine. This is going to be a little bit of an experiment. I thought it might be kind of interesting if I took you guys on a literal and figurative journey. So I am on the road. I'm actually on Route 66, and I am heading to DC for the AVMA, or the American Veterinary Medical Association, continuing education conference. And I've been to one of theirs before. It was in Chicago. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. All veterinarians are required to have a certain number of continuing education hours. You also hear them called CEUs, or continuing education units, every year. And the number of hours is determined by the state. So, for instance, Virginia requires 15 hours every year. But then if you're a member of certain organizations, they require that you also have additional continuing education hours. And certain things like management or business don't necessarily count towards your state's credit hours, so frequently you end up with more. The other cool thing is with AHA, they often encourage even more CEUs, and so you get like points if you think about their accreditation system kind of as a point system, which is not to say it's a grade, but it's just that's kind of how they help evaluate. They encourage or reward the more CEUs that you have. I thought it might be kind of interesting to explain to the non-veterinarians out there who listen, I'm sure there's at least one, that we have, what it's like to go through the continuing education process. And so there are small and there are large conferences. AVMA is a large conference. And a friend of mine who's a veterinarian said you can always tell when there's a veterinary conference in town because it basically looks like a Lilith fair. Which is, it's all women, and we're all like in not even business casual, right? It's like mostly tennis shoes and Birkenstocks and khakis and jeans and t-shirts. If you look at a human medicine continuing education conference, everyone's dressed in like either business casual or suits. So it's kind of funny. But at the same time, like human doctors are standing and talking to their patients. Veterinarians are on the floor talking to their patients, but we frequently get covered in excretions more than our human counterparts. The purpose of this is going to be to take you around and kind of explain what it is that we do when we go to these continuing education conferences, and just give you kind of a taste of how veterinarians expand their knowledge as their career evolves. When you go to these conferences, they're usually multi-day. In this case, I'm just going to the Saturday event, and in part that was just scheduling. And the nice thing is because it's in DC and I live in Virginia, I could actually drive. I didn't have to get a hotel. But in addition to the cost of the continuing education conference itself, there's usually travel costs associated with it. So CE can be very expensive depending on what it is you want to do and where you want to do it. Every day they will have a list of lectures, and you basically choose which lectures you want to go to. And the way that they track it so that you can count, because each lecture usually counts as 1 credit hour if it's a 50-minute or more long lecture. And the way that they track it is dependent on the conference. There's one conference in Las Vegas where your little name badge like scanned it, and they had these little... It looked like open road tolling, where you would walk into the conference room and it would magically scan your badge, and that's how it registered. So then at the end of the conference, you would just go to like a kiosk and print it out and make sure that it tallied it correctly. The only downside was like if you had to go to the bathroom, sometimes it would log you out and not count it. So you had to like hide your badge in your shirt while you went to the bathroom and hide it when you came back. And then take it back out when you were leaving, because otherwise it would think that you were like skipping out on the lecture. Some places work on the honor system, so I believe that the AVMA convention, there's an app, because there's apps for everything now, just like there's herbs for everything. And the app, you can create an agenda, so you pick where you want to go, and usually I'll pick 2 or 3 lectures that I am interested in at that hour. And part of what determines which lecture I go to is interest level as well as location, because the DC Convention Center is huge, right? So if one lecture is on one end and the other lecture is on the other end, and I have 10 minutes to get there and I have to use the bathroom, I may not be able to get there in time, and nobody wants to be that person that walks in 5-10 minutes into the lecture, just because it's rude, not necessarily because it won't count for your CE hours. So that all kind of factors in. The other thing that can sometimes be frustrating is if you have a really, really popular lecture and there's not enough space. And I ran into this with the AVMA convention in Chicago. It was like a majority of the lectures I wanted to go to, they didn't anticipate, I don't think, how many people would attend. So you would try and go to the room, and because of fire hazards, they would only let a certain number of people go in. So then they would have what they called overflow rooms, and so they'd stick you in this other room where you'd watch on a monitor the lecture that's happening in a different room, which I found entirely silly, because in veterinary medicine, and I'm sure it's similar in other medical fields, you can have a certain number of credit hours online. So if you do an online course, only a certain percentage of your hours can come from online course, because they want to ensure that there's active learning. Well, if I am paying to go to a conference and I'm still in the end just watching it on a screen, to me that's really frustrating, because I don't see how that's any different from non-active learning that they would consider online to be. It's also frustrating because you're paying to go see the lecturer and you can't really see them because you're watching them on a screen. And the other frustration is if you have questions afterwards and you want to talk to the lecturer, if you're in the overflow room, there's absolutely no chance you're going to be able to talk to him before you need to go to your next lecture, because you'd have to leave that room, go into the other room, fight the masses of people who are already interested in talking to him, and then hope that you and that person still have enough time to ask your question. So I'm hoping that this is not going to be as problematic with the overflow as last year. My thought was I'll take you guys kind of on a little journey, and I'll tell you which lectures I'm attending and maybe a little snippet of what I learned from each lecture, and then we'll just kind of put it all together and see how it works out. As you can tell, I was in my car when I recorded that, and I had these grand aspirations of, after every lecture, talking to every presenter and having them summarize the most important aspect of their lecture. And I did it for the first 3 in the morning, and then it just got a little too chaotic. So I figure that probably is about as much as anyone's attention span can handle, is to summarize 3 lectures. So I'll review what each of those first 3 lectures was about, and then I have the person presenting the topic actually summarize a key point afterward. And I gotta say, I was really impressed that of the 3 lecturers that I asked, none of them seemed surprised nor hesitant. They were just like, sure, go ahead and record me. And then after the first 3 lectures, the AVMA did something different this year, where for I think it was a 2 or 2.5 hour block, they didn't have any other lectures except their keynote speaker. So everybody who was there went into this massive hall. And I think, honestly, they were trying to hone the excitement and the mentality of Connexity from last year, because all of a sudden there were like all these lights and it was a light show, and then all these people started singing Bruno Mars, and it was very confusing because at first I thought there was going to be like a flash mob, but it was just like 12 people who I guess sing, I don't know if it's their living or it's their hobby, but they sang this Bruno Mars medley, and then they sang Journey, and then they sang the Star Spangled Banner, and I just found myself standing there in the back because by the time I got in there weren't any more seats, and I just thought, what am I looking at? And I think that, again, they tried to hone Connexity, but it was just, in my opinion, it didn't really fly. Like, it just seemed over the top, and like they were just trying to compete with kind of the family atmosphere that Connexity had established. And it just, to me, it was just a little too much. Because then there were these giant heads of presidents that apparently come out and dance at all of the Nationals games, one of the local Major League Baseball team here. And then they chased around the president of the AVMA, and he got up and talked about how proud he was of everything, which was neat because I didn't really honestly know who the president of the AVMA was.
But again, it was just a little much. But what was cool was we did get to hear from the Surgeon General, who was pretty funny, and I probably shouldn't admit this, but I didn't actually know who our Surgeon General was. But it was very interesting, and he talked a lot about the opioid epidemic and how he wants everyone to carry naloxone, which is the reversal agent for a lot of these opioids, which I think is an interesting concept, but I'm not really sure if, like, we're supposed to now go to the pharmacy and say, I want naloxone, and they just give it to us, or we have to go to a human physician and say, I want to carry naloxone, the Surgeon General said I should. So I was kind of unclear on how that happens, but it was very interesting. And then we had our keynote speaker, who was pretty awesome. She is a human doctor, Dr. Barbara Natterson-Horowitz, who used to be a cardiologist, and she started studying something that she called zoobiquity. So it's really about how we can learn from the behavior patterns of wildlife and have that teach us about how human behavior evolves, as well as how as humans we should act. And it's kind of a neat sociologic way to look at the world. And she has a new book coming out that she was talking about called Wildhood, and it compares the juvenile experiences of a lot of different wildlife and how that pertains to humans. And it was kind of a neat, like, meld of human and animal, which I think is what they were going for with the whole idea of, like, One Health. So, everybody has medical health that we should be aware of, human and animal. And so it was very interesting. It was just, to me, it was like a weird concept that I had to see this. I enjoyed it, and I'm glad that I went. And they did give us continuing education. I think we got one CEU for it. But it was just an odd concept to me that the AVMA was trying to copycat the Connexity format, although they say that imitation is the greatest form of flattery. And while they gave it a valiant effort, I do not believe, in my personal opinion, that they were able to achieve the same effect that Connexity had. I think it's kind of neat, but I think when you have that many people, thousands of people in a room, it's really hard to get them all to connect to one kind of common concept. And it's weird to be used to a certain format as far as getting your credit hours. You go in, you learn, you leave, and now all of a sudden you're forced to... You go in, you can pick what you want, except for this. This you have to watch. So that was kind of weird, but I think it'll be neat to see how it evolves from there, but I will say Connexity did it better. So the first lecture, going back to why I'm doing this podcast in the first place, the first lecture I went to was about heartworm disease. And it was very interesting. They had a couple of concepts that I hadn't really thought about before, or at least hadn't thought about it in this way. So one of them was the idea that protecting dogs against heartworm disease, we should think of it more as herd health. So if a larger percentage, this is kind of how we think of vaccines, as, a larger percentage are protected, therefore the ones that are not protected, it reduces the risk of them getting infected. So that's kind of how we look at vaccines too, right? So if we have a large population and a majority of them are vaccinated, then it reduces the risk of disease spread. The other thing that was really interesting was he talked about the concept of what's called antigen-antibody complexes. So an antigen is a foreign protein, and an antibody are part of your immune system. And doxycycline, which is the antibiotic that we use when they are first diagnosed with heartworm disease, not because it kills the parasite, the heartworm parasite, but because it actually kills a bacteria called Wolbachia that lives on the parasite itself, and it makes the heartworm more susceptible then to the treatment that we use. And apparently while they're on doxycycline, it can block the presentation of the antigen or the protein, and that's what we test for. So when you run a heartworm test and they test positive, you're testing for the protein produced by the female heartworms. And so if you block that protein while they're on doxycycline and for a short period afterwards, it can make them look like they don't have heartworm. So all of a sudden they test negative. But that is a false test. They really still do have heartworm disease. It's just not showing up. Now there is a acid or heat step that you can add to the testing that breaks up that antigen antibody complex, and it prevents those false negatives, which I thought was really interesting. The other concept is a lot of times when we do these, they're called SNAP ELISA tests. So we put blood with a conjugate and we dump it in a little well and they get sucked up and you snap it and then you wait for some dots to show up, right? So a lot of times people think the lighter the dot, the less an infection. But apparently in heartworm disease, that does not apply. So the weak positive doesn't tell us anything. And you can't get any more weak than negative, is what he said, which I thought was kind of funny. So if it's negative, it's negative, right? But if it is a light blue dot,